Hi everyone, thank you for connecting with us. We're very delighted to have a special guest, Phillips O'Brien, who is actually a professor of strategy in University of St. Andrews and has been one of the best writers about the war of Ukraine and in general wars in current times. As you know, we're in a time that is not precisely peaceful. A lot of things that we thought that wouldn't happen, such as having war in Europe, are happening. And that makes us want to know more about it, how we should think about these events, how wars are right now, right? We think very different about Ukraine than when we started the war. So that's Phillips has a new book that in fact hasn't been published in the US yet. It's going to be published the 28th of October, which is called War and Power, Who Wins Wars and Why. And that will help us to think about current wars. We'll have the book as soon as it's sold in the US, we'll bring it here. And thank you everyone for coming. We also have Pablo Garcia, professor from the School of Business, who has a lot of knowledge about strategic thinking. He will comment the book. Phil will talk to us for about 30 minutes, kind of summing up his book, and then Pablo will make some comments, and later we'll open the floor. If you want to ask, you can also ask in Spanish. Si quieren, pueden escribir la pregunta en español y la traduzco, okay? So thank you, Phil, for being with us, and you can go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, Bernardo, and thank you, Paulo, for taking part in this. And I'm really delighted to give this talk because the book is, I think it's sort of a culmination book of thought over a long period. For those of you who might know my work, before this, it's mostly been about production and grand strategy and war in the first part of the 20th century, primarily the Second World War. But I've branched out into more late modern stuff recently. And so this book was sort of an attempt to bring a lot of different ideas together. The book came about because I believe that we are facing an intellectual, academic, analytical crisis. And that crisis is people do not know how to talk about power and war in a way that makes sense. It happened first, I think the sign of the crisis was what happened when Russia launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. When you go back to that moment, from late 2021 up until the invasion, there was near unanimity. In fact, it's hard to find anyone who disagreed publicly with the consensus. And this was a consensus that stretched from think tanks to universities to the massive intelligence services and militaries of European and the United States. They all agreed on one thing, and that would be the war would be quick and Russia would conquer Ukraine in a matter of days. That indeed the head of the U.S. military, the most senior soldier in the United States, a man named General Mark Milley, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, went to Congress in January 2022, just before the invasion, and with access to all the intelligence and analysis that the senior soldier in the U.S. has, he said Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, would fall in 3 days, and that the war would be over not long after that. This is a problem. When we say here we are in 2022, when we have all of these analytical bodies who are devoted to trying to understand how militaries work, how power works, how wars develop, and when they have no idea what they are looking at, and I actually think that's true. I do not think the intelligence communities and the analytical communities had any idea what they were looking at when they made these judgments, then that to me is a sign of crisis. So one of the first things I did after February 2022 was put together a research project to try and study the specific analysis of what people were saying would happen when Russia invaded Ukraine. And that was, you might say, the launch project to this book. That came out. If you're interested in it, you can see the report. It's free to download on the website of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, CSIS. I co-authored it with Elliot Cohen, and we basically did a report on the specific analysis just of what a Russo-Ukraine war was supposed to look like. The more depressing thing, and many depressing things came out of that report, believe me. Maybe the most surprising and depressing thing is that actually I went back in time and I looked at strategic analysis in the first part of the 20th century and compared it to today. And the shocking thing is we seem to have gotten worse. That was indeed quite surprising, that as we have become bigger and have many more institutions doing the analysis and many more people with degrees and supposedly experience and with access to intelligence, you would think we would get better. But actually, we've gotten worse. That the kinds of analytical mistakes we've seen recently, and these are ones, by the way, they go back to the United States War on Terror. Again, the United States thought that would be an easy and quick war. That we have gotten consistently worse in knowing what war is going to be like when it comes about. In the first part of the 20th century, what I found is there was actually a lot of acceptance of doubt. When people, we don't know, how war is going to work out. It could become a mess. We know these kinds of general factors matter, but we're not going to try and say something like Kyiv will fall in a week, that Ukraine is doomed. So oddly, while we have gotten bigger and have all these institutions, our judgments have become stronger, but they've actually become poorer. And I think that was one of the reasons why I started this. The other thing I noticed, and I'm in an international relations department, and I don't wish to be too controversial about international relations, but I'll say a little point, that the theories didn't work. That there were a lot of theories to explain how powers behave. You might say the most famous ones are realism, and they come in different forms: offensive realism, defensive realism, different kinds of realism. But they simply bore no, I would say, resemblance to what happened and how they decided to classify the powers. The realists were overwhelmingly of the view that Russia would quickly conquer Ukraine because Russia was a great power. And not only that it would conquer Ukraine, but it almost had a right to conquer Ukraine. And so realists had certain assumptions about how war and power would work. And I really thought they were problematic. So that was sort of the genesis of what I was trying to do when I discussed putting this book together. And what I didn't want to do is come up with a theory. So the book is not a theory on war and power. What it is it tries to provide a framework of understanding. In other words, when you look at a power, this is the way to think about how it will act. I don't provide answers about this state is powerful, this state is not powerful, but these are the factors to take into consideration when you try to look at a country and say what its power is. And then the second part of the book are how does that power actually interact when it comes to war? So in 5 chapters, I try to take the first 5 chapters on power and say, okay, when we address a war, these are actually the issues to talk about. And so I'll give you a quick outline of how those work in this, and then we can move to the conversation point. The power thing, the number one thing I tried to say is where people got power wrong is they tended to look at the militaries. So when people said, why is Russia a great power? And by the way, I hate the phrase great power. And I say that regularly in the book. We can have a conversation about that. But to me, great power is not a real phrase. It's actually a title. And it gives someone, the title itself is almost becoming a prophecy of what you think they are. I would just drop the phrase great power. I had an article in Foreign Affairs about that about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, saying we should get rid of the phrase because great powers are really never great. And I hate the word great, but we can go into that. But what people did is they tended to judge power by looking at the military and say, okay, well, Russia has 3,000 tanks, Ukraine has 800 tanks. Russia has X number of aircraft, Ukraine has Y number of aircraft. The Russians have so much ammunition. And so they looked at the metrics of military power, and they said that will determine for Russia why Russia is a great power. And that just seemed to me absolutely getting it backwards. A military is not a thing in and of itself. A military is a product. And to understand the military and how it behaves, it's not as important to look at the public manifestation, the tanks, the aircraft. You need to look at the elements that create the product, because those will tell you a lot more about that military than actually what it looks like on parade. So the first 5 chapters are an attempt to look at the elements that create national power as opposed to the outward manifestation of the military. And you might say that they go in what I hope is a logical fashion about how you build that. So the first chapter, and I'm really glad that Paolo is an economist, and a lot of my earlier work has been on production and indices of munitions production in the Second World War, is that the number one thing a country has which sort of establishes a possible power level is where its economic technological capabilities. Now, you cannot be a very powerful state, I would argue, unless you have certain economical technological capabilities within you. And that is because ultimately, as the chapter says, you have to make stuff. Now, I know people got, what does that mean to make stuff? Well, the whole thing about power is you have very little idea when you get into war, and I'll talk about that, what you're actually going to need. One of the great fallacies of war is that the armies that exist when a war starts are going to be the armies that decide it. That never happens. The armies that start a war are almost always destroyed very quickly or very heavily damaged, and completely new militaries are made. So to be a power, you have to have the ability to make stuff to adjust to that. Buying stuff, if your militaries are just made up of stuff that you buy, you are much weaker than those militaries are on paper, because once you lose that stuff, there's nothing you can do. You can't make more. So you really are just a short-time force that has no, you might say, depth to your power. So you have to start with that ability of economic and technological capability. Now, as I go on, having established that as the base, that's not enough either to understand what matters. Because you might say that you have to have that, but you can still have that and not be a significant global power, militarized power. The most famous examples of that in the 20th century would be Germany and Japan after the Second World War. From 1960 until probably 2000, Germany and Japan were the second and third largest economies in the world. And they stay that until the Chinese pass them sometime after 2000. And yet at no point during that time did Japan or Germany wish to be global powers, strategic powers. So why is that? Whereas many powers who don't have that power, like Russia, try to be that, and they have problems. Well, then what are the variables we need to look at to see how economic technological abilities are translated to power? One is leadership. And this was something that I think was interesting in IR theory. IR theory tends to discount leadership. So if you're a realist, say, you tend to say regime type doesn't matter, right? I mean, all regimes, if you're Mearsheimer or Waltz, regimes don't really matter because all states are doing the same thing. All states are basically trying to maximize their position in an unstable, dangerous world. So all states in some ways are bastards. All states want to expand, all states want to take over their neighbors, regardless of the regime. The only thing is that's just simply not true. Certain states invade, certain states don't invade. You live in South America. You actually haven't had a lot of wars and invasions with borders for 100 years. So not all states are trying to maximize their power in an unstable world. Certain states have leaders that do try to be militaristic, certain ones don't, and it changes. It matters whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump is president of the United States and how it will behave with countries around the world. I.e., there's no guarantee that a Russian ruler other than Vladimir Putin would have invaded Ukraine. And if you look in the early 20th century, so leaders like Mussolini matter very much to the course of Italian history. So you have to look at the leadership because I think there's a bit of a con that is played in the discussion of international relations. And that con is that, and by a con, I mean a confidence trick. So by the way, if my English is too slang at times, just stop me and ask me questions. The con is that there is a quote unquote national interest. States love to use that phrase. We are doing this because it is in our national interest. The other thing, I've never actually seen that defined. And usually when I look at history, the national interest isn't what's in the interest of the nation. It's actually what the leader wants to do. That's actually what defines the national interest, is the leadership's choices. So you have to take the leadership and say, okay, how is this going to act with the economic technological capacity that you have? But the leaders themselves don't operate in a vacuum. So we go to the next stage in the process, which is one of the most difficult stages to understand because it's complex and it doesn't have rules that it's quickly followed. I don't like theory because I don't see any theories that work. But the next stage in the process is how does your society and your political structure shape the leaders' attempts to use the economic technological power? Societies have very different reactions to the use of force at different times. Certain states have societies that are aggressive, want to expand, certain states don't. Certain societies are very militaristic in conversation, certain societies are not like that. So certain societies are united. I mean, the United States has gone from a very united society in the Cold War to a deeply divided society now. Right? American society is not the same now as it was during the Cold War. It is far more partisan when it comes to issues of foreign policy. So that these, society matters and political structure matters, because those are in a sense shaping variables on the leadership. So that's sort of how it built on the power to that point. And then the final two chapters in the first 5 were to look at things from a bit of a farther out perspective. One was to say, okay, then look at a military, chapter 4, based on these 3 previous chapters. And that will tell you about that military far more than adding up its tanks. If you look at a military as a structure created from the first 3 chapters, that will say, oh, well, the Russian military actually isn't that great because its economy and technological abilities were limited. Its leadership was very particular and hyper aggressive, and its society was not always, excited about this. And these are ways to look at it. And then there's the final chapter, which is something that I really think has been missed, and that is the role of allies. One of the reasons I loathe the great power idea is because hardly ever do states act as powers, individual powers. And usually, by the way, acting as an individual power is a road to ruin. It's one of the reasons I just don't like great power. However, you could have great alliances, that actually diplomacy and alliance behavior explains a lot more about power than individual state behavior. So the Cold War, for instance, is not the United States versus the Soviet Union. It's 2 very large alliances facing off against each other. And the real difference, you might say, isn't between the US and the USSR, it's between the alliance structures. So the US has a much larger and more powerful alliance body with Western European economies, with Japan, South Korea, and the Russians have Eastern Europe, which is economically falling behind and doesn't want to be its allies. Then they lose their most valuable ally, China, halfway through the Cold War. So you could actually say, that looking at individual states doesn't matter, but looking at alliances really does matter. It's one of the things that drives me a little crazy about the US today, is that they are deliberately offending all of their allies. And they might be in a process of getting rid of many of their historical allies, which will be a huge blow to US power. So those were the first 5 chapters that built to understand power. So I'm going to do time-wise. Okay, I'll try to wrap up in 10 minutes about war, and then we could go to the discussion part. The chapters about war were therefore based on what happens when these elements war is in a sense when power goes from the perceptual to the reality. All right, when you usually in peacetime, you're trying to guess how powerful a state is, but in war, the reality comes about and you see. The number one thing I wanted to say is, in means of analysis, we look at power by militaries engaging in battles. If you think that's going to decide a war, which is probably the simplest way to try and understand war, because the original battles in a war almost never decided. There's hardly a war that's been decided in its opening stages. It's almost always decided by factors that you have no idea will actually decide the war when it starts. So don't worry about the battles. Don't look at war as time-limited engagements over pieces of space, which is the way it's often portrayed. It's the way the Second World War has been portrayed. It's the way the Ukraine War has been portrayed. Battle of Bakhmut, Battle of Avdiivka. These are actually places of irrelevant strategic value. Instead, you have to look at war as a process. And there are certain indicators within that process about how the war is developing. So the chapters from that try to say, what are the things that matter in the process? And what they are I tend to say there's human factors and there's material factors. And it's these how they interact. The human factors, you might say, are ones of morale and societal commitment. That really matters. That if people are willing to fight, your war will be very different than if people are not willing to fight. And if people are willing to fight, then you can be the Vietnamese and take on the greatest superpower in the world and beat it. So the idea that that you can look at war by a material factor alone is just wrong, because the larger side often loses. That it loses because another side is more committed. It also matters how well your people are trained, how well your society remains determined to fight the war. So you have to look at the human issues. But then you'd also have to understand the material issues, because the material issues, in some ways, as long as your society remains committed to the war, then the material issues will be decisive. And the material issues are sort of what I talked about before. Can you make things? Can you actually make large numbers of the best things? Because wars we like to see as, won by bravery. This is like Pete Hegseth's comments, the US Defense Secretary, were madness the other day, as if war is won by muscle-bound morons charging into combat. That means muscle-bound morons charging into combat will almost certainly get killed very quickly. Certainly they'd be killed very quickly now in the war between Russia and Ukraine. This war is being determined by production and technology, drones, air vehicles, artillery. It's not being won because one side is braver than the other. So you have to look at, so you need to look at the ability of what they can make, but then how those things can be adapted, which is a real test of an economic system in war, because what happens during the war is the things that you make will change far out of expectation. So the most important example in this war are drones. In 2022, neither Russia or Ukraine had a drone industry. They hardly made them. They were really tiny elements of their productive processes. Now they're making millions and millions a year, both sides. And they've had to make these industries up. And if you can't do that, as I said, if all you can do is buy your weapons, you'd be doomed. We were talking ahead of time about South American defense industry. Any war in South America, then thankfully there won't be one, or I hope there won't be one, would be a catastrophe for all sides because no one can make anything and they'd blow up their weapons first. And then I have no idea what would happen at that process beyond that time. The last parts of the war section also go back to the question of alliances, which people misunderstand or underrate as well. It is almost certainly by the end of the war, the stronger alliance is won, not the individually strongest state. So if you look at history going back to Germany in the First World War, Napoleon, it could very well be argued that Germany in the First World War and France under Napoleon were the individually strongest states on the continent at that time, but they both lose the war to larger alliances or more powerful alliances. So that was sort of the framework. And then there's the last chapter, the conclusion, which my publisher really wanted, which is to say what might happen if the US and China go to war now. This chapter has gotten me in a little trouble with the Pentagon because I try to say what I honestly believe. The United States would lose that war because the United States might be able to win the opening battles. The United States military is probably a little more combat effective than the Chinese military now and can inflict more damage. However, what the United States can't do is make up what it loses in anything like the way the Chinese can. And it's also losing its allies. So the United States is sort of setting itself up right now at present not to be able to win a war with the Chinese. And that was sort of how the book works. So I'll cut it off there. That's about half an hour I've talked. And I'll turn it over to Paolo.
Thank you, Phillips. Pablo, you want to?
Yes. Thank you. Let me just look for my presentation here. I have some slides. I hope it's not too lame, but I got a few slides because they also rhyme with much of what Phillips has said. So I enjoy the book a lot. So first of all, I'm an economist. I'm not an expert in strategic studies or international relations, but I do have a penchant, an amateurish penchant for that. So I really enjoyed it. And what I want to say is basically 5 things. First, why this is an important book. Okay, I think it's an important book and it should be read widely. Then there are a few arguments that Phillips makes that I totally agree with, and I just want to highlight why I believe they are very important to our understanding of how the world works and how conflict works. There are a few things that I don't agree with. Some of them you mentioned. So I realized that every economist is a closeted realist in international relations. It's part of our way of looking at the world that makes realism as a sort of a natural frame of mind. And I think there are some ways of looking at it that are actually useful. And I want to point those in particular on how to understand something that keeps on happening, which is offensive war, which is always called preemptive war, right? This keeps on happening. Russia is a later example. We have plenty of examples in the past. So I think there's a framework that can help us understand why this happens and also understand what your criticism of the attitude of let's say, the West or NATO has been with respect to Russia, and also how to understand what might happen in the future in Taiwan. And I want to close a bit with some reflections about that. So why this is important? First, it covers a vast amount of material. Every page is just chock full of episodes, anecdotes, analysis. It is a short book, right? It's very welcome that it's a short book. And also it is very opinionated, right? So here you won't see the typical economist approach as well. On the one hand, on the other hand, the historiography of this and that. No, you will get very strong opinions by Philip on all the topics that are put there. But I think that's useful, because it allows to cover a lot of stuff in a relatively short amount of space. It also helps to dispel certain naive certainties that are very prevalent. International conflict is complicated. The approach of narratives about battles and war, typically that are popular or simple, are almost always miss the point. And it also, as Phillips mentioned, he provides not a theory, but a framework of looking at about strategy going forward. The world will continue to be complicated. Much of what will happen in the future hinges on the war in Ukraine, and also what, if anything, happens in the Indo-Pacific. So probably for the next decades, what happens in Europe, what happens in Asia are the big questions, and the world will be different one way or the other. So I think it's very important to take a look at this from this framework. So what do I agree? The first thing that I think is very interesting is the myth that there are decisive battles that wins wars. This is the Kane fantasy. You know, you have the big battle that kills your enemy's army. But then Hannibal ended up losing the war. He wasn't able to dismantle the Roman system of alliances in Italy. So I think it's very interesting to see that even though the military have this fantasy, it actually didn't work in practice. So one very big lesson is don't focus on the battles, focus on the wars, focus on the process. The interesting thing is that this myth has lived on for ages and ages and ages, and every time you see a war starting, you have behind it the idea that there will be a decisive battle and the war will be over. This was in World War I. Barbarossa, Hitler said, we just kick the door and the whole thing just comes crumbling down. The initial attacks by Japan, the Gulf War, particularly 2003, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there's plenty of examples. I would say, pretty much every offensive war in the end has started with this idea that there will be a big decisive battle that would end it all. So it's maybe we're just stupid or irrational, but there must be some explanation behind this, right? Also, in the chapter about war, on the chapters about war, the idea that there will be a wonder weapon, remembering Ukraine thinking, no, we need the Leopard tanks. No, we need the M1 Abrams. No, we need the F-16s. And it's just, the reality is just significantly more complicated. The idea that you can win wars alone, the idea that morale, offensive outcomes like in World War I will make it all, the fiction that is a short war. So this myth, alongside with the other ones, the amazing thing is not that it's a myth, but it keeps on happening. It keeps on happening. The second myth, I guess, is actually as an economist, is very important. Here I'm putting two books that I read from Phillips because I wanted to prepare for the presentation, and I think they were very interesting. So the second most powerful man in the world, right? Probably nobody knows him because that's the idea of the title. This is the chief of staff in World War II, Admiral Leahy, right-hand man of President Roosevelt, who was the most important man of the war, right? Essentially, management, logistics, the system, not the brilliant general that wins the war. Also, the focus on the economics of scale. Phillips has a table that I didn't know about the marginal or the cost of producing airplanes as the war progressed and how they went down. This actually has been studied in economics, in particular in modern theories of endogenous growth, and specifically on the productivity in the production of Liberty ships and how it clearly started to go up over time. The cost of producing came down as shipyards became more efficient, as learning by doing was developed, and therefore a very strong case for economies of scale and the productive sector is present in the book. Not the military power, you need the whole system behind, particularly the economy. We can talk maybe about Latin America specifically about that because I think it's a different case. Now, the area where I don't agree that much is this idea that international relations and realism is sort of broken. Right? He disagrees with the presumption that the world is divided between great powers and the rest. He disagrees with the idea that there is a well-defined national interest. I don't want to defend this, right? I think I agree with the criticism, but I think that the reality is a bit more complicated. If you go to the index with all the material, there's a lot of reference to a lot of things, but there's not a reference to game theory. So I think game theory does provide at least some semblance of framework for understanding realism. I think the main criticism for the economic approach to international relations of the realist school is this idea that you have sort of a smooth optimization process that allows you to choose exactly what you want. this is not really well suited for one-off things like war, and therefore you need a different approach. And for that, game theory is a much better toolkit. So a few references. I found this book, this very recent book called Realism in International Relations, The Making of the Disarray Tradition. So international relations and realism is in disarray. And my analysis of why this happens is because game theory is in some way also in quote-unquote disarray. The fact that game theory is a better toolkit doesn't mean that it gives an answer. Actually, it gives multiple answers all the time, particularly because when you have strategic interactions, so I would call great powers those countries that actually can influence the rest. It's not great, it's just that you are influencing the rest. Whatever happens depends on what you believe might happen if you don't follow the path that ends up happening, right? So the beliefs about things that you don't happen is very important to determine what actually happens. And that means that there's a scope for multiple equilibria, everything goes, and that's very uncomfortable for a theory, but I think it's useful as a framework for understanding. So let me just give you an example. My reading of history and my reading of game theory means that wars start because you need to have a number of things lined up. First, you need to have a set of motivations that basically put all your domestic constituencies behind the idea, either from racial, ethnic motivations. For instance, Ukraine is not a real country. Ideological, political incentives, we don't like Western liberalism. Economic dimensions, we really want Ukraine to be part of the big Russia economy. And military strategic considerations, well, we are scared of NATO, right? You need to have specific constituencies that are really concerned about this all lined up. But then this is very fragile because how do you keep everybody happy? Well, you sell them the story that it will be a short war and that the only thing that matters is the military power. So the fact that you have war starting under the myth of the short war is not a bug, it's actually the feature of why this happens. So Putin believed, maybe he didn't, but he had to sell the idea of a short war. Hitler had to sell the idea of a short war. The Japanese had to sell the idea of a short war because that's the only way the war would happen in the end. You cannot sustain this very broad coalition under the promise of, well, Churchill did it, but he was being under attack, so that's maybe easier, right? For the offensive war to happen, you need to have this belief. And the problem is that how do you end up doing this? By having this other thing or this other setting that if you don't do it now, we will lose the opportunity. We have a window of opportunity. We are going to be attacked. We need to attack first. If not now, when? This happened in World War I with the Kaiser. This happened in Japan in 1942. This happened in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. They will have nuclear weapons eventually. So there's always this framing of we need to do it now. It will be short. It will be decisive. We will win. And everybody goes behind that idea. When this doesn't happen is because you have a collective security, which in economics is the Pareto optimum of no war, okay? And then when this fails to be self-enforcing, when you don't have the self-enforcing process of collective security, you end up with the situation of these preventive wars. I think nuclear war is a very good example. We haven't had nuclear war because it's self-enforcing. In some way, collective security in terms of not starting a nuclear war has become self-enforcing, and thankfully we haven't had nuclear war. So I think it's one example of where this game theoretic approach actually helps. Now, let me just skip this because it's just a detail, but thinking about Ukraine, right? So I believe that the Ukraine case fits this narrative very well. Over the medium run, there was a window of opportunity while Ukraine didn't join NATO, because if Ukraine joins NATO, the opportunity to attack it disappears. So on the face of, from a medium-term point of view, for Putin and Russia, they just had a few years. And then, you probably remember, Phillips, this idea that they needed to attack after the Winter Olympics in Beijing and before the mud hit in March. So they had just 2 weeks to do it, and they will be over in 2 weeks. But the interesting thing is that this was happening in spite of the fact that NATO was supposedly off the table. But was it really? I think that's the belief from the point of view of Russia that NATO was not definitely off the table, that triggered this sense of fatalism, narrow window of opportunity, if not now, when? Going forward, I guess the main uncertainty, of course, who knows, right? Who knows if the decapitation attack in Kiev in 2002 was predetermined to fail? We don't know, right? It could have happened if I taken the airport. Who knows what would have happened later? But I think today, the main uncertainties regarding the path for victory is that, or the main certainty is that Russia has been willing to suffer 1 million casualties, which wasn't given in 2022. And there's a significant degree of uncertainty whether European soldiers are going to be put in harm's way, whether Germany, France, or the UK are willing to put soldiers and be shot at by the Russians. So these are the off-path, right, situations. If there is a lack of credibility in this idea that there will be security guarantees, I think the chances of Ukraine winning the war are much slimmer because Russia has shown a willingness to suffer humongous amount of casualties and Putin is still there. How do we think about Taiwan? I guess the main path for avoiding conflict is to avoid this fatalist view of a narrow window of opportunity. How do we make sure in the world that Xi Jinping or China don't come to think that there might be a window of opportunity? And I think there are 3 factors that could trigger it. One, if Taiwan moves decisively towards independence and starts to receive international recognition. Maybe that is unlikely, but it could possibly happen. Then internal turmoil, leadership instability, and using an external conflict to solve the problem. The Falklands, I think, Argentina was a very good example of that. And the third one is the succession crisis. What happens after Xi Jinping? He won't live forever, in spite of organ transplants, I guess. So the question is, what happens in this succession crisis? But at least from the point of view of the West, Europe, at least don't push for independence of Taiwan. Don't open this sense that there's a window of opportunity and try to prevent having this fatalist view impose itself into Taiwan. I don't know what will happen. Who knows, right? But at least let's try not to create this sense of fatalism in the views of the leadership of Beijing. So conclusion, this is a very, very nice book. We could be talking all day about it because there's so much in it. But I guess it's very important to see it as an exploration of power, understanding history and the views of Phillips about it, and also this framework for understanding contemporary situation. Thanks a lot again for the opportunity.
Thank you. Do you want to react first, or if you want?
Well, I first of all want to say how flattered I am that you've read the work so well and the other work. I thought that was amazing and impressive. And there's no way I can engage with all the points. I have about 10 points, which really you said things that made me think. The one thing maybe I would be really interesting to have a discussion about, which you pinpointed, is the short war idea. And I'm wondering, why they do it and the impact. I'm wondering if actually the short war idea has gotten us into more wars than anything else. And that's why leaderships and states do it. Because if anyone said, actually, we're going to get into a war that'll take 5 years and have 2 million dead, no one would ever do it. Where it's very easy to say we're going to get into a war and have a parade in 2 weeks. No one's against it. That's part of the reasons I wanted to write the book, was to just put that to bed, the short war idea. But it does come out. On a realism point, Paolo, I wanted to ask one question about material. I actually used to be more of a realist, like in How the War Was Won, the Second World War book, which is really materially bound. I think what surprised me in the last few years, and where I was wrong, was how things like information warfare actually can affect material. So if we just look at the material in a realist way, I wonder if we miss certain element. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as a realist and an economist, that actually it's not just, if it was just the production alone, then this would be a very different war, because Ukraine's being backed by Europe and the United States, which can make far more than Russia can make. But Russia's been very successful in information warfare. And how do you work in things like that into your realist perspective?
Right. Okay, just a quick reaction to that. I would say that the realism thinking that you have a sort of a unitary state is wrong. You need to think about this coalitional approach. That to push for a massive war, even though you sell it at a short, you need to have the business community, you need to have finance, you need to have the unions, you need to have the public, right? Everybody needs to be behind this idea. So one way to undermine the opponent through information warfare is to make that coalition harder to construct itself. So some have argued that, for instance, to oppose China or to deter China, the West should engage more into disinformation and sort of information warfare against China. But the question is, if this is perceived as an existential threat, maybe that triggers a war, right? Maybe it becomes so dangerous that it triggers a war. So it could be a different dimension for the same kind of a final result of creating a war through other means. It's not a material, it's just information warfare.
Okay. Because it seems to be something where I now believe I was wrong in not understanding its importance 3 or 4. I mean, I had a Second World War view where propaganda was sort of propaganda didn't change anyone's mind or really influence behavior. Whereas information warfare, which is propaganda in a way, is very valuable.
Right. Yeah.
But so, I mean, that was an amazing set of reply, and I really, really appreciate that.
Thanks.
Do you want to read the questions, or I summarize it for you if you want? There's some questions.
Oh, here they are. Okay, I didn't.
So the first one talks about, like, given that international relations and coalitions are so important, how do we think about it now that the global governance, right, is afraid, to say the least?
I think the U.S. Yeah, the U.S. international rules-based order was partly a figment of imagination, but partly real too. You know, it was one of these things that was like Schrodinger's cat. You know, is it alive or is it dead? Was it there? Was it not there? It certainly had institutions like the UN, WTO, whatever, that were part of this order. But it needed to function at all. It needed the commitment of the U.S., and that's gone. So I actually think that we are in an entirely different world than existed a few years ago, which, where the U.S. rules-based order, for all its flaws, I just don't see, if the U.S. isn't behind it, that it has any validity to function. So I think we are in a very, very different world. And I don't know if it's one that is more realism or like that, but it's one where war is far more likely to happen than we understood or planned for, because there will be no brakes on war that would happen. So you could have regional wars, you could have globalized wars. You are going to have far more bilateral disputes. I mean, what you see Trump doing on tariffs, that just didn't happen, under the older system of the individual states fighting all the time about tariffs. But if the United States isn't going to enforce WTO rules, and right now the United States is the greatest enemy of the WTO, then we're in a world where you could have trade wars at any time on these things. So we are dealing with an unstable world that is more unstable. One thing that I think is odd is that people didn't understand how much they had baked into their assumptions that the U.S. on the whole would be there. The Europeans basically lived in a strategic, almost dream world where the U.S. would do their strategic thinking. And they didn't have to think about defense. They didn't have to think about security. They would just know the U.S. would be there. And so this is really hard for European states now. Partly they want to stick their head in the sand and go back and think Big Brother USA is going to save us, because they don't want to face the reality of a world where they're going to have to look out for themselves. I mean, what's going to happen in Venezuela, in South America? The idea of the U.S. as a good neighbor, that's not there anymore. The United States could now be doing active regime change in Venezuela very soon. They could be having a militarized border with Mexico very soon. So certain assumptions on behavior just have to end. I don't know what comes afterwards. I don't think it's going to be good. I don't know, Paolo, what you think about that.
So there's two things that you mentioned. One, the role of the U.S., and the second one is Latin America. So in terms of the role of the U.S., I totally agree on this view that the end of World War II was essentially the creation of this collective security system, the Pareto optimum, right? Offensive war is illegal. Wars cannot be changed unilaterally, right? Or even bilaterally. So, but this only works, this is a bureaucracy, this only works if the bureaucracy has this shorting cut, as you mentioned, the spirit of multilateralism. So if you withdraw that, if the US withdraws its interest, we are just left with a bunch of bureaucrats with no mission to fulfill. And I think we are clearly going to there. So you are going to go to a world where there's no incentive or no self-reinforcing mechanism for collective security, except perhaps in the nuclear space. Perhaps nuclear war or nuclear peace, if you want, is self-reinforcing. We'll see. Latin America, I think, is different because Latin America, on the one hand, interstate conflict is exceedingly rare. Most of the problems in Latin America are internal. You have social outbreaks, inequality, political violence, crime, right, drug trafficking. So these are the main challenges. So it's within state at the risk of creating a failed state, and maybe the Venezuela situation is that. Now, I wouldn't say that the U.S. in doing things in Venezuela heralds a new world, because the world hasn't been very good in terms of the relationship with the U.S. and Latin America. But the Venezuela situation is so blatant, in so many dimensions, that it becomes a problem. It's a problem for everybody. It's a problem for everybody in terms of immigration, in terms of crime, in terms of security. They've threatened war against their neighbors, right? Brazil is concerned. So maybe more of a coalitional approach again vis-a-vis Venezuela needs to be taken there. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Yeah.
What's interesting about Venezuela and scary about U.S. behavior is that they're not even going through the motions of pretending legality. They always went through the motions of legality, or if they were being illegal, they kept it quiet. Now they are literally just sinking ships that represent threats to nobody or nothing. And not only are they not caring about the legality, they're putting pictures of those ships being sunk up. So, they are, you might say, legalizing piracy on the high seas. And that is, to me, different. I mean, that is, something's changing when they're doing that.
Well, he declared war to the drug dealers, right? In a way, when you declare war, you're indirectly declaring war with Venezuela. And there is a small step to declare to another Latin America.
Yeah, but the United States has not declared war on Venezuela, but the president is acting like there's a war.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if
you there's no congressional authorization. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
Amelia has a question. What role would you give organized civil society? By the way, I have to say the chapter that I found the hardest to write, Amelia, was the chapter about societal influences on power and also on war, because it doesn't work either. There's no model, I think, that explains it. It's just really important. It's one of those things that you cannot look at a power and understand a war unless you look at how societies behave, and they do behave differently on that. And I would say more, it's a question of united or divided societies. I mean, there's a big difference, as I said, about the U.S. Bernardo, you wanted to answer that, so why don't you jump in there, right?
No. I'm just moving the questions that you already answered. So Martin asked how about our relations with Latin America and Europe, given that they seem to be weakened alliances. And Rodolfo asked, where do you think that we didn't have so many wars in Latin America because maybe rulers thought it was unlikely to win easily, right? or there is a low support. And I will add one question, which is like, you can think that Europe has a lot of power right now, but there is a cost of transitioning from like having technology, a big economy, to having actually the weapons and being in war, right? So how do you deal with that? How can you don't have an army, now have a huge army? What is the cost of the process to do that?
It's one of the I mean, if there's one thing that I think in the newer world, which has changed, is that the value of soft power, which is what Europe was often banking on, has gone down. You know, soft power is, I would argue, less valuable than it was before. And Europe, in some ways, was banking on soft power. Or you might say trading power, economic power, to do things, because it didn't really believe it had a major security issue that could result in war. And that's why Europe is in many ways punching far below its weight. You know, Europe is actually, you know, not that much smaller than the US economically. You know, if you're looking at GDP, and GDP, I know, and Paolo can tell me far more why it's a deceptive statistic, but, you know, if you look at it, GDP, Europe as a whole is actually not far from the US, but it's far less influential in the US as a strategic power, one, because of structural and societal and military issues. I would say if one thing, you know, that you would think that Europe and Latin American nations do actually have a lot in common now, because an unstable US is something that might at least drive them to cooperate more. That you know, European and Latin American states are not going to want a US, which is basically the United States is now a revisionist power. People have to understand that. You know, the United States is threatening Denmark and Greenland. It is threatening Canada's existence. It is threatening Venezuela. It is threatening Mexico. The United States is a revisionist power. Now, Latin American states and European states are not. They're status quo powers. And as such, you would think they would have some element to get along. I mean, it could be that the United States, and this is what some people say about Trump, actually wants to cooperate with China and Russia as three revisionist powers. You know, China has its sphere, the United States has its sphere. By the way, Latin America, you're in America's sphere, according to Trump. Yeah, and that's the way the world will be divided up.
That brings me to there's a book by Sergei Radchenko about the Cold War from the point of view of the Soviets. I don't know if you read it. And it's very interesting because he mentions that the only thing that the higher-ups in the Politburo, the Secretary General, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, the only thing that they wanted, it was to sit down with the US and be recognized as an equal partner and divide the world, right? And now that's why Putin was very happy to attend the Alaska summit, I guess. Getting to sit down and then sort of split the world.
That matters to leaders hugely. You know, when we're talking about leader psychology, you know, it matters hugely to leaders that they are taken seriously as great global powers. And yeah, Sergei's book is very good. By the way, the lack of interstate war. I mean, I have to say, Paolo, I'd almost like to hear this from you. But that South America, to me, is one of the great examples why realism has flaws. Because you don't have, you know, the lack of interest. If all states were basically the same, right, all doing the same thing, no one could say that South America was a stable world. You know, there's a lot of instability that would be triggers for war, political instability, economic instability in Latin American history in the last 100 years. But it hasn't actually spilled over into state-to-state warfare much. And that does make me think that leadership, societal, you know, outlook behave differently in different states. But I would actually like to hear from you why Latin American states don't go to war.
To follow the what I was mentioning in the presentation, I guess if Latin American states had the same social cohesion and internal stability like European countries, maybe we would have had a lot of more wars. But the first matter was getting the house in order, and I have to say we haven't really reached that out, right? And the second I think the second reason is that the US has essentially shunned upon conflicts in Latin America. even now, there was this the Milei situation when Milei announced that for the first time in decades he was going to revamp its air fleet and buying F-16s. Some defense analysts in Chile said, "Oh, this is very concerning." And my view was like, "No, this is great, because if Argentina and Peru have the same planes that we have and they're all Americans, there's never going to be any war between us, right?" And also one needs to consider the distances and the geography is a huge hurdle. It's a huge hurdle.
Well, it just is. Certain places are different. Latin America
Right.
seems to be behaving differently than other parts of the world.
Right.
I mean, the argument of Paulo also was that because Latin American countries always have conflict within the country, then you don't go outside. So maybe the US is going to that, right? They have so much conflict within that they use the cities as a training ground for eventual interstate wars.
Well, certainly. I mean, I didn't see this happening in the U.S. There's so many things I didn't expect, and if you had asked me 20 years ago, would the U.S. be like this? I would have said no, never. With troops in the cities and the divisions in the country are so extreme. I'll give you one example where societies change. I mean, this thing is society is not a steady state in the way societies look at issues. That one of the things I'm interested in is how American public opinion reacts to wars. It's just an interesting something I've written. I wrote about it in the First World War, and I've studied it today. But there was a really big shift in the late 1990s. Before the 1990s, Americans tended to look at wars not from a partisan perspective. So, if they looked at something like the Vietnam War or whatever, they would be influenced by, can we win the war? Or, how many casualties are we suffering? But Republicans and Democrats often responded quite similarly to war based on a series of questions. Beginning actually with, it's something that probably hasn't been focused on a lot with you, the bombing of Serbia in 1999 or something, whatever, 1998, 1999. You started seeing people saying, Republicans support Republican wars and Democrats support Democrat wars. So, Democrats overwhelmingly supported that because Bill Clinton was president, and Republicans, who everyone thought liked war, were hostile to it. But then that reversed completely when George Bush became president and invaded Iraq. Then Republicans overwhelmingly backed it, and Democrats overwhelmingly opposed. And we've now gotten to the point where every foreign policy question is not done on a national basis. Republicans will react one way if it's a Republican president doing it, and Democrats will react the other way if a Democrat president does. So the country is absolutely divided on partisan lines on foreign policy. And that is a change. It isn't the way the country behaved before. But it's one of those ones that has come in, and that's very worrying about what the United States will do.
Okay. This left us very depressed, but thank you so much, Phillips. This was great, and good luck with the tour and the podcast and everything. And thank you, Pablo, for commenting, and thank you, everyone, for being connected. This was
thank you, Pablo, for those brilliant comments.
Pleasure.
Really,
I will send you a presentation as well.
If you're coming to Scotland, if you or Bernardo are ever coming to Scotland, you must come to St. Andrews. Okay.
I will. Okay, great.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Take care.